Okay, welcome to You Talking with Greg. I am thrilled to have my friend Bruce Alterman here to share with us some of his story, his perspective. Bruce and I really haven't been talking that long, but I fell into some of his work on integral grammatology, and I was like, oh my God, this guy is super deep. I want to talk to this guy. And ever since, we've had a number of wonderful conversations, and my horizons are broadening every time we do. So Bruce, welcome so much. And thanks so much to the podcast.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. It's a delight to be here. And I really have felt in sync with your recent video that we just put out, in resonance with you and your ideas. Really love what you're doing and exploring. And I don't know if you remember, probably our first contact was, I think it was in the Metamodernism group. You were posting some of your ideas, and I asked you if you'd ever checked out E.F. Schumacher and the Guide for the Perplexed.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, wow, that you looks like that might be a precursor, someone anticipating some of where you're going. So
that's so cool, because somebody just reminded me of that. So here's the story, Schumacher. I think I circled into his idea at some point when I was actually in the Wilber community, and I vaguely remember that, but I didn't look at it carefully. And I literally read that book. I skimmed it maybe, then at one point I read it because somebody prompted it within the last 2 weeks. I read it through and through. And it's a remarkable, in fact, I was going to do either a blog on that. So this is the synchronicity and the syncness between us. That's so cool that you were that prompt, but I was going to do actually a blog on updating a guide to a perplexed through the UTalk and TOK. It's a remarkable, simple, really easy to read, but remarkably congruent with unified theory of knowledge on many, many levels. It's a fascinating moment for you to bring that up. That's cool. Yeah, I remember that now, but I'd forgotten that was our first contact.
That book impressed me back in college. I was at a Christian university at the time and was mostly exploring contemplative and more spiritual kinds of texts, but I picked up that book. And that was one of the first kind of prompts that stirred me to look more seriously at philosophy. And so that book stuck with me. It was very simple, but very direct and elegant and unifying. And, it was one of the, I think, early prompts also towards looking for models of coherence for me.
Yes, I think it's got a lot of resonance with Ken Wilber. I don't know if Ken Wilber, I certainly thought of that as I read it. So just for folks that don't know the book at all, I think it's a 1977 book, if I recall. But it essentially is critiquing the materialist flatland scientistic view. It is trying to revitalize and bridge essentially a great chain of being, a sophisticated philosophy, a respect for a sophisticated theology, and it has a Christian flavor to it. But it really does a beautiful job of arguing against reductionism. It lays out almost sort of mathematically, it sort of lay out, well, first there are matter minerals, and then you add to that life, and then you add to that for him consciousness, and then you add to it self-awareness, and it's like, plus A, plus B, plus C, plus D, and each of these is self-awareness and consciousness and life, and that's exactly a tree of knowledge ontology. And then it moves into an epistemological frame of reference viewed from the inside and then other insides, and then has a very clear behavioral view from the outside. It's a really, really, and that just maps, and it's so rich and textured across the various levels and very alive. And I appreciate, especially now, I would have been, been my own atheistic background. I'm like, oh, okay, it's a little spiritual. Now it's like, no, it's a mature spirituality view that he's trying to garner respect for. So I really encourage folks to take a look at that. And it's like 126 pages plus a 20-page appendix. And you basically are like, a day and a half, and you're through it. And it's a really, really worthwhile piece of work.
Definitely agree. Yeah. And I think he probably did at least implicitly influence Wilber, though I haven't seen Wilber reference him.
I'm certainly citing him in my current book as I articulate that on a couple of different places. So, yeah. So anyway, that's this is just, it's endless to what we could talk about. So one thing I do want to ask you, because I haven't really gotten this story yet, and it'd be really good because I'm really feeling a synergy with the integral stage world. And, this conversation should probably come out on my podcast right after the one with Layman Pascal, or at least in a similar sequence. So my affinity to you and Layman is strong. And I'd love to then hear your sort of story about your getting into integral and what you see in the integral world and the construction of integral stage, and just your background and history in that community.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think I came across Wilber's books when I was fairly young.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was maybe late teens or something like that when I came across Wilber's books initially, and I didn't like them. I thought that they were too heady and too abstract, and I just didn't relate to what he was trying to do.
Interesting.
But a number of things kind of unfolded in my life at that time, and prompted, I think some significant internal changes and external changes that eventually led me around to appreciate him. I think maybe just before that time, I had gone through in high school a series in a very short period of multiple tragedies. Many people I knew in my life died in a very short span of time. Most of them students in my school. Just different things happened, shootings and suicides and accidents, and just boom, 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 boom. It just, it all happened at once, and it really devastated me. And a friend's mother offered to send me on a retreat up to the mountains to get away from the horrible pall that had settled over our small town in Texas after all of those events. And I responded to that and went to the retreat and had a very beautiful experience up in the mountains where I felt very, very deep sense of communion with just with the landscape and the silence and the majestic, earth, and something in that sense of openness and silence and presence really struck me as a as a spiritual moment for me. And I could see my own kind of internal self-contraction and anguish and what had turned into a kind of knot of anger around all of that. And I decided this looks like a scar in the midst of this pristine open wilderness where things are what they are without complaint. And that just like shifted something in me, and I decided I can choose not to let these events turn me into the angry person I was becoming. And so the first place I looked was Christianity, because that's the only thing I knew. And because of that experience up in the mountains, I looked immediately towards more of a contemplative Christian approach. Couldn't really find it, especially in a small town in Texas. I approached Catholic priests, and I couldn't find anybody who knew what I was talking about in terms of the kind of sensibility I was feeling. And
about what time is this? I'm sorry, I interrupted you. About what time?
Yeah, this was probably 17 years old, maybe something like that, maybe.
And about how old are you? Just out of curiosity, because I'm guessing we're in the similar ballpark there.
Yeah, I think 45 now.
Okay, all right. Yeah, yeah. No, I can position myself in that timeline.
Right. Yeah, so I was looking for something. I discovered the books of Thomas Merton, and because I was writing poetry at the time, and somebody said, "Oh, your poetry sounds a little bit like Merton," and they handed me, and I read his 7-Story Mountain, and that inspired me to look maybe at a contemplative life, but it didn't happen. But in that whole time period when I was looking then at spiritual books, eventually I came across some Ken Wilber books and some
Right.
books by Jiddu Krishnamurti and
Mm.
some other things. And they began to pull me, even Thomas Merton's books, where he was meeting with Dzogchen masters and with and traveling over to Asia to dialogue. I was opening towards more of an interspiritual sensibility, not just, I wasn't finding a home
Right.
in Christianity where I was looking.
Right.
So I began looking more broadly. And at that time, Krishnamurti really impressed me.
Mhm.
He was very, very much about paying deep attention to what's happening in consciousness without metaphysical ideas, without religious attachments,
Mm.
just really attending to the nature of thought and consciousness
Mhm.
and all the complexes like fear and guilt and envy and all those things
Mhm.
in a very direct, immediate way that was shorn of kind of the metaphysics that were disappointing me in the Christian communities.
Right.
Because I ended up going to a Christian college and
Mhm. Mhm.
had some beautiful experiences and some very, very difficult experiences with the conservative people who,
Right.
yeah, made me feel uncomfortable.
Sure.
So I think it was through that I saw Wilber's books initially, and they didn't really impact me.
Okay.
But then a number of different events happened. My mother ended up with a very difficult divorce. We lost everything.
Wow.
And I dropped out of college, and my mother and I went on the road with no house and only $800 between us.
Jeez.
Because she'd had $1 million
Like an
business.
adventure? Really?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
She'd had like $1 million a year business that got crashed in this terrible divorce and just absolutely lost everything. So we just went on the road and ended up living in the wilderness for about half a year while we tried to get our feet. But we drove to Arizona, and I lived in the wilderness and hiked the canyons every day. And of course, I looked for work, but no one wants to hire somebody who doesn't have a home. But eventually, I did find a home. I mean, I did find work, and then we were able to save money, and we got a home, and restarted, and everything's back on track. We never imagined ourselves as homeless, just on just as a period of need, a nomadic period of being cut loose from the familiar.
Remarkable. Huh.
Yeah.
I bet if a lot of us listeners are like, wow, that would be cutting loose from the familiar. That's pretty.
It definitely was. It's like an immersion in a lot of frightening things, but also some really remarkable things. I had probably some of my first kind of intensive several-day mystical experiences while out in the wilderness. And so those things really started sparking something new in me. And, I think this is just, coincidence, but I remember being out walking in the wilderness turning a corner and looking at a vista and thinking that looks just like India, even though I had never seen India and didn't have any sense of India. But right after that, some things just began rolling that eventually led me over to Asia.
Wow.
I got offered got offered a teaching job in Korea.
Okay.
And I went to Korea and taught a couple years and studied some meditation there and music. And then I had money, and I decided to go travel. And I went to Indonesia for a year, and Malaysia and Thailand.
Wow.
And then I went to India for another year, and to Nepal. And so during all that time, I lived mostly at ashrams and monasteries, or at a Krishnamurti school in India. So they afforded a lot of time for study. And I was able to read, many, many different books on philosophy and spirituality and art. And I studied music everywhere I was. And when I eventually came back, I actually met a Tibetan Lama in Nepal that I had a really immediate connection with. And I asked him if I could stay there and live with him in his monastery and study. And he said, yes, but you need to finish any kind of outstanding obligations back home first. I don't want you staying here if you have unsettled business back home.
Okay.
And I said, I haven't finished my undergraduate. He said, you better go finish that. Your parents won't forgive me if you stay here and forgo that. Right.
Okay.
So I went back and finished it.
Okay.
And interestingly, within 2 weeks after returning to Texas to finish that from all that exotic adventure, I met somebody who turned out to have been raised by this Lama in Nepal.
Huh.
And
Wow.
he was just visiting town that week, and I just met him. And yeah, so I began studying with him, eventually went to Virginia and lived at his house in Virginia for a couple of years.
Wow.
But it was during that period that I came across Wilber's books a second time. And reading Wilber's books at that time meant something different to me.
Right.
For several reasons. One, going deeply into Krishnamurti's work, while I really appreciated, the intensity of focusing inwardly on movements of consciousness and thought and trying to understand how thought arises and how impulse and how conditioning functions, all of that, I began to be hungry for the narratives of human history. And because Krishnamurti was very, very strongly against, don't read any of the old past books and try to get stuff from it. Just be fresh,
Okay.
And it was useful for me, but I began to think that's actually a dialogue of long human thought and reflection that has something of value in it.
Beautiful.
And, I didn't want to just arrogantly cut myself off from that dialogue.
Right.
And so that, when I came back to the United States and I saw Ken Wilber books again, I had felt this need to integrate, Western thought and some of my, early studies in Western science and mythology and things like that, with all of that Eastern contemplative experience I'd gotten over a few years. I wanted to figure out, how do these things go together, right? All of these aspects of my life are meaningful and enriching,
right?
And those worlds are often not bridged. And I found Wilber was attempting that.
Certainly, he's in that place, right?
Exactly, yeah. So I thought that was really what I wanted, was not necessarily to follow Wilber or anything, but to engage in that kind of cross-cultural mediation, bridge making, coherence building. And so those were those first impulses. And I began to then value Wilber's charts and maps and stages and all of that, because I could see now,
right,
having been through those different experiences, where they can fit.
Where they fit. Yep.
Yeah.
So you had sort of that intellectual schema. You had unbelievable and rich experiences with the contemplative world. And then we're now building the narrative, East and West as well. And you find Wilber along those lines. You also got at some point interested in Roy Bhaskar, or at least you had some connection. Was it, were you pretty much located in the Integral community? When did that happen? And you then also branched out in all sorts of meta, I know.
Right. I went to, after living for a number of years in Virginia.
Where, by the way, did you live in Virginia, just out of curiosity?
In Charlottesville.
Oh, okay. So I'm 30 minutes away from there.
Awesome. That's great.
My daughter went to the University of Virginia, lives there now. So, we're very familiar with the Charlottesville world.
I used to go to UVA sometimes. I took some classes there. I have some friends who were, doing their PhDs there. And I eventually, I had been in a rock band years ago. I always like to say this part because it's like the brushing with fame, but it was a rock band with Billy Bob Thornton's brother.
Oh, okay.
And after I had been in Virginia for a while, I recalled something our sound engineer had said, which was that there was a school in California that teaches, kind of holistic forms of psychology that bring East and West together. And so I remembered that. And at the time when I was playing music, I wasn't interested in that at all.
Okay.
But now it suddenly seemed like it might be something I want to pursue. So, I had finished my undergraduate, and then I took off to California and went to that school.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the context of that school that we went deeper into Ken Wilber's work. They also used Ken Wilber's work in some of the courses, and
Right.
we sent the school every year sent a cohort of students over to Ken Wilber's house to spend a weekend with him and
Okay.
ask questions and
Right.
so we did that, and
Huh.
he introduced at that time that they were just about to launch this media project called Integral Naked, and so I was one of the first people to sign up for that.
All right.
And that got me into the integral world more concretely then.
Right.
And that's where Layman talked about where we first met. I was there as a character named Balder, and he was there as a character named Iconosostocles, and we both,
Perfect. Balder and Iconoclasticles. That's perfect.
yeah. So we met each other that way, and eventually, I began interested in diving deeper into what Wilber was talking about, because I could both see the strengths of what he was doing, and also he's taking some shortcuts and some things don't make sense. And so I started a forum called Integral Post-Metaphysical Spirituality, which Layman also told you about, that he joined later, and we also hit it off on a number of topics together. But it was that inquiry that actually turned for me a kind of self-generated PhD course in philosophy, and that there were about 4 of us who were core members. Layman was part of that, and others. We got really deeply interested in understanding what is post-metaphysics, what's the whole philosophical background, what's the new emerging speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, and so Heideggerian thought and Whiteheadian and Badiou and so all of those things. I began with a group of people. We just dove into that for probably 6 to 8 years of just reading deeply and writing and conversing with each other around those things. And it was in that context that I discovered Roy Bhaskar's work, especially references from the object-oriented ontologists and so on. Levi Bryant often talks about Bhaskar, and so I wanted to know what is going on with speculative realism. I mean, not speculative, critical realism, with his critical realism. And it eventually, Sean Hargens, Bjorn Hargens, also was getting into that and beginning to organize some dialogues with Bhaskar, some of which I was able to attend.
Right. I saw that you were included in some of the early, there was a meta theory in the 21st century book, and I happened to see your name as listed as one of the, and when they were doing the conferences together, I think in terms of the integral critical realist, the early crit stuff, CRIT, critical realism, integral theory. I don't know the history very much, but there was a series of conferences, right, from like 2011 to 2014 or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think Zach Stein was part of those, and Benita Roy and a number of people.
Yeah. Couple people right in this new meta space. That seems to be a sort of original bubble over there.
I think it was. I think there was a lot of synergizing that happened around that has been fruitful for all of us.
So then go ahead. Yeah, sorry, it's a rich story.
I think that I came to a good stopping place. Whatever you like to talk about here.
Well, I guess then we'll fast forward now. And now all of a sudden there's this new, to me, this is a new meta space emerging, right? And certainly the Bhaskar Wilber is a good indication of that. And I like to think of my own little mini trajectory in relationship to that, I was alone doing my little thing in the middle of the academy, which is interesting,
Right.
Sort of smack dab in the middle of the academy. I'm doing this, I'm talking to all these people, and then individually I'm having all the synergy, but there's just the academy has no interest in, what is this or how it would actually organize around itself. And then to be sort of launched out, complicated ways, whatever, but all of a sudden my whole orientation from within the academy to on the fringe. And now I have my own little history of like when I first encounter Wilbur, I sort of come at it from the natural science angle and from a real, much more precise what is psychology angle. And I'm trying to carve out my space. And in fact, I should have been more aware of Wilbur than I was. And then I have this initial reaction, oh, that guy's, he's not a real academic.
Right.
That's the arrogant whatever inside the Blue Church. And now that I'm barely a real academic anymore, with cartoons and everything, it's like, oh, suddenly I'm a much better appreciation for what Wilbur is trying to do. And I've really, and then especially the intersection of Roy Bhaskaar's critical realism and ontology and epistemological fallacy critique of science, coupled with Wilbur framing the quadrants in epistemological terms, that synergy, which I discovered, that book and talking to Zach Stein, just really a powerful and beautiful synergy. And it intersects with my work in a particular way. So that brings our journeys then over the last, climbing up sort of Meta Mountain, as it were.
Yeah.
May the Mount Sophia on one side and a tree of knowledge and elephant sun gods and gardens on the other. And you and I, boom, intersect. So I'm a couple of things I'm really curious, and then I'll let you so I'm really curious about grammatology, your integral grammatology, the space of integral stage, and sacred naturalism. Those are lovely things that I would love to talk about. And I'll throw those out there and see if you want to pick up one of those threads at this juncture or some tapestry combination.
Sure. I think one thread I want to pick up kind of like leading to that is in my own work, trying to integrate my experience from the past in Asia, especially, and trying out different, especially religious traditions, none of which totally fit, but I experienced them in a way that was beneficial for me.
Yep.
But I was deeply interested in how do you bring together different religious perspectives in a way that can promote peace among these different traditions and also lead to synergies that are growth producing for the multiple traditions, because I could see that in some of my own heroes, and I could see that in myself, that there had been this mutual enrichment, but there weren't theologically many frames that allowed for that holding together.
Right.
And I wasn't, of course, comfortable with the exclusivism of traditionalism. The inclusivism of modernism I didn't really like, because usually it just chose one position, whether it was the scientific or the Christian or whatever, that was the top one, and then tried to fold everyone into that.
Right.
Pluralism was better, but it was not satisfying because it basically was just, too relativistic.
Too chaotic.
So exploring that led me to, in my own thinking, towards trying to articulate, a integral pluralism. And so that was the field where I first started exploring just what's the shape of an integral pluralism in terms of interfacing multiple paradigms and worldviews. And then, when especially Sean began looking at critical realism and complex thought in relationship to integral theory and trying to articulate how those can go together. You saw in one of my papers, I also tried my own hand at that.
Yep.
And so that was, the building of one kind of meta space was the dialogue emerging among the followers of Morin and Bhaskar and Wilbur.
Okay.
But then more recently, we're seeing similar synergies happening between and among metamodernists, Game B, UTOC community, integral deep web syntheist, and integral people.
Yep.
So it's just like this flowering where I think multiple communities are recognizing each other across different, discourse boundaries, and saying, hey, we're brothers, we're sisters,
That's right. That's
and
right.
so that's been a deep interest, is to for me, for the integral stage, for Layman and I, is we want that to be a place that can allow for that meeting and mutual reflection
Right.
to be amplified and to just to continue to flourish however it's going to.
Beautiful. Yeah, I really like, in fact, that's what in 2011, that's what the term integral pluralism is what I use in the Unified Theory book to characterize the sensibility. So it's exact. And then I think it was Mitchell in at least some academic description of a way of understanding biology, I believe, if memory serves, identified that terminology, that dialectic as a particular frame. And then so I happened to see him use that, or her. But anyway, so that's super cool, and I also was like, as a postmodern grand meta narrative, meta modern integral pluralism. And speaking for myself as that synergy, not super connected with all of these things, it just is almost the synchronicity of the emerging cultural sensibilities and how they happen, in line with one another. And I think it's a beautiful, seeding, growing thing. And now this interconnection between these various domains. And the integral stage really does look like a special hub in relationship to making connections in the integral plural meta-modern space.
I hope so. Yeah. Thank you for affirming that, because that's definitely, an aim or a mission. We're still very small, but definitely as Layman mentioned, we've been fortunate enough to talk to very many different kinds of people, and it's been, super enriching and exciting. I actually have a series coming up on integral life that I'm going to be doing together with Rob Smith and with Paul Marshall.
Okay. Well.
Yeah, looking at basically the intersection of critical realism and integral theory. So Rob says he wants to try to bring some content to the Integral Life website that isn't only so Wilber focused, but that looks at what's emerging a little bit more broadly in the meta communities. For my integral grammatology, I know you and I have had several talks about it, so I'll try to say something that's not redundant to that.
Okay, great.
But yeah, in the context of the Integral Post-Metaphysical Spirituality Forum, where we were doing kind of that deep dive into multiple lineages of thought, I began to notice just different fundamental orientations in different camps of thinkers, especially in object-oriented ontology and speculative realism and some surrounding communities, where they seem to focus more on structure or on process or things like that. And I noticed there was like either a verbal emphasis or a nounal emphasis. And I began to think, are there other emphases? Are there other paths which focus on other parts of speech and other essential metaphysical constituents or foundations for how you put together a worldview? And I began to just read around. I came across fairly soon in that reaching around and searching Latour talking about prepositions.
Okay.
And Latour was especially drawing that from a French philosopher named Soriot and also from Michel Serres, both of whom talked about prepositions to some extent. And they held them in a different way. They regarded them as a kind of metaphysical departure from antiquity, which usually looked for substances, essences, substances, structures or processes. And with prepositions, there was a move away from that towards looking at the interstitial generative
position
spaces.
In relation.
Right. And Latour was using prepositions to build his own one of his own models, which he was talking about as modes of existence and beginning to see how you can interrelate different modes of existence. So that was an interesting thread for me. I began to look around, are there adjectival, are there adverbial approaches, and I found them. And I knew Wilber, of course, focused on pronouns with the I, the we, the it, and the its. So that just like, it looked to me that there are, fundamental grammatical philosophies that are really deeply informing different philosophical traditions.
Beautiful.
And Wilber's integral impulse was looking around at different schools of psychology and meditation, usually which dismissed each other. And he wanted to figure out
about that.
Yeah, right. And how do you make them more coherent and complementary to each other rather than, exclusive alternatives. And so I felt that same impulse with these different philosophical traditions I was exploring. And I found this grammatical kind of lensing allowed for a different kind of facilitation of worldviews and metaphysical approaches that, our forum was dedicated to post-metaphysics, but in one sense, it was a move that I would call meta-metaphysical. You're taking a meta perspective to metaphysics to understand, and there's an enactive ontoepistemology involved in that. This enactive where you recognize that in holding this frame, it allows you to see something, but in that seeing, it actually changes you and how you're holding. And there's this loop that happens, generative participatory loop. And so, that became kind of what I wanted to explore as onto choreography, this circulating through metaphysical lenses in a playful, generative way.
So let's see. Let's fill some of this in from my angle. This I think is beautiful and it's brilliant, and it's very, very influential, and it's influential in a couple of different intersecting areas. So I'll share a little bit about, and a little bit of this history, but just for people that are listening, okay? And so one of the things that I got super interested in is the concept of behavior, okay? Because then both in terms of breaking it off in relationship to, one of the things that I realized is that behavior isn't so much a topic in psychology, but really behavior is an epistemological framing that psychologists engage in to gain access to the mind, okay? So we want to study the mind, but the scientific perspective is such that you can't really gain direct access to the mind, or at least there's one way of saying that if we take a third person exterior epistemology, we can't see the first person dimension of the mental. And so we then have to study it indirectly. And if science is going to have this capacity, then we'd get mind and behavior really broke off so that the behavior is accessible to the scientists to then infer what the mind is, okay? Now, why is this? This is directly related to your grammatology, but I need a little backdrop for people to see this. So then I make, and then one of the insights that I make, which other people have made but has not gotten the attention, is that actually what's happening is science is applying its general epistemology. What's evolving is applying a general epistemology to the mental. What does that mean? The general epistemology is behavioral, okay? And what I then see is that actually science in general is about behavior. Like the fundamental concept in science is behavior. Okay? And the metaphysics of behavior as an observer. So you observe the science, you position observer, then to observe objects, fields, and change, okay? And this was influential for me for a couple of different reasons, because I had already, one of my insights was, the problem of language and propositional speech is the problem of justification, okay? And the symbolic syntactical structure at the very base is nouns. We tag what is, okay? And then we tag as they change in verbs, okay? These are some of the fundamental essence of speech terms. Nouns and verbs are very foundational. All right. So now I'll take nouns and verbs and we'll upgrade this and also then say, actually what scientists are doing is they're observing objects and then not object, which is the field, and then over change, and then they'll make some observation in relationship to it, okay? So then you have what I always see, the grammar of behaviors, the noun and the verb being observed.
Right.
And the grammar then structures the relationship between the perspective, the participation with the objective, and the intersubjective propositional language system. Okay? So now grammar, just so folks are aware, grammar now is going to cut across the phenomenological structure, the interpropositional language, the shared intersubjective language, and the way in which it transacts and participates in the objective. Mm-hmm. All right? So when you talk about metaphysics, the idea that we would take grammatical lensing through the various sense-making structures is, in my opinion, unbelievably brilliant. Because what it does is it affords you then a very, very abstract doorway into the way relations are construed. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's why metaphysical integral grammatology actually makes brilliant, perfect sense. I mean, it's just sort of like you can come into the fundamental architectures of knowing and enter through. This gets in what I know what Layman does in terms of adjacency, get through certain kinds of deep structures that actually form the glue of what people are looking through. But now you can get off of and then look at that and see it with a level of coherence that you wouldn't have seen before. And thank you for that, because that's what happened to me as I internalized your position. All of a sudden I was gaining perspective on stuff that I was looking through before, what wasn't looking at. And then when you get that, that's a meta shift. And that's what I got out of your grammatology. And it's absolutely brilliant.
I really appreciated how you described that process. I know we had talked a little bit before about, some of the impact on your thinking and what you were seeing, but I really found that was what you just said now was just so beautifully and clearly and exquisitely expressed. And it also helps me take an object back on looking at that and see it in a different way too. So I really appreciate that.
Great. I'll start one more thread on this, just so that, because I really believe there's a hyper conversation hooking up here. So I mentioned nouns and verbs. Okay, so the other thread is me, John, and you. Now, John Vervaeke. So another way, there's nouns and verbs. Well, John then brings a particular grammatical lens around adverbs and adjectives. Okay, and those that watch the Entanglement will not know this, but basically, your adverbial qualia in consciousness is the framing, the top-down framing of the witness function. So this does the moving around of the frame. And then the adjectival qualia are the actual properties that one experiences, okay? So this is like if you experience red or you experience the taste of grape soda or whatever it is, that's on the screen, and then the adjectival is framing the screen. So there's another grammatical organization. So we have nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbial. And then John and I were trying to piece together, okay, where does this actually come from? Because you need a lot of cognitive architecture to get to what would be like, this is like a global neuronal workspace model, okay, in sort of more cognitive neuroscience kinds of language. But actually it requires a lot of architecture that I think presupposes or overshoots early forms of sentience, okay, which I believe are sort of these embodied flashes that connect flashes of pleasure and pain. Okay? And I believe that actually where we get qualia out of are the flashes of pleasure and pain. This is consistent like Antonio Damasio, and Mark Solms is coming out with this argument, and it's basically a flash to approach and avoid. Okay? And so I built that for a while, and John was like, well, yes, that's the early care indicator of recursive relevance realization, and it may emerge prior to the architecture of the adverbial adjectival consciousness. And then, well, where does that come from? Well, if the system can send out a signal, approach, avoid, that's embodied, it's positioning itself in relation toward and away. Okay. And then we were like, well, what is that? Well, let's call it valence qualia. We have a dialogos moment where it's like, okay, it's not adverbial or adjectival, but it's sort of this precursor that is valence qualia. Well, we synced up on that about, 4 weeks before I came across your prepositional. Okay. And then what is toward and away? Okay. It's actually the signal of the relationship between the animal and the environment. It's just a total. So even beneath the adverbial, adjectival, and noun verbal propositional, certainly beneath it all is a prepositional jolt. Okay. And so this goes into the bottom. So we metaphysics. Now this is like the embodiment. You follow that down and you see that prepositional relation. So both of those lines of thought became apparent to me in relationship to, as I read Mount Sophia or Sophia Speaks. And it just is really, really, again, I'll just say thank you for it, because it really is a synergistic, holistic picture that is very, very, I'm a big coherentist. I always love that stuff. And when I find somebody that sees something like that and helps me piece it together at a meta level, it's just a joyous thing.
Yeah. When I was watching the Untangling the World Knot series and I heard you guys getting into valence qualia, I was just getting so excited. I was like, they're talking about that. I really felt that you had entered that space that has been so deeply interesting to me too. And when you feel others resonating in that space, it's just, I don't know, I get a rush from it. It's
totally.
Like,
that's
church, right?
Dialogo spirit, right? Actually, that's a great line, because actually I don't in terms of yes, this is the revitalization. So there's a real movement here. Okay, I mean, this we lead into the hyper conversation and the meaning crisis, the mental health crisis. I'll see what you think of this. I just was doing supervision with somebody. Okay. And they're seeing college students, okay? And the guy comes in, and she's like, well, I have a really nice family and childhood, but I'm just dead inside, There's just no meaning. There's no engagement. I'm checking off boxes. And we, in the college student world, we see this a lot these days, okay? And I was just talking to my supervisor about, well, what do we do? Like, where is our culture in relationship to in growing the soul and spirit?
Mm-hmm.
What are we doing that feeds that? I'll use Zach Stein's term, like, we're cultivating so much skill development out here, but where is the ensoulment and the transcendent spiritual development? And that to me is, I believe that one of our great tasks in the 21st century is to figure out how to reboot the meaning into and mental health, correlates of that dynamic, and bring a sacredness to the world, to infuse a sacredness to the world. So what are your thoughts about what you're seeing, what you hope for, what your role is in this space and doing things in that ballpark?
Yeah, it's deeply interesting to me. And, you mentioned before the sacred naturalism,
yes,
which is definitely a thread that's one that I want to continue to follow and unfold. We did a series on that, which I know you shared with your.
I shared with the listener. I strongly recommend it. It's a series of 6 or so conversations. You introduce it, Layman starts it off. There are a wide variety of interesting perspectives that are, different flavors of sacred naturalism as it bubbles up to the surface.
Right. I'm curious. Have you ever heard of the ecological philosopher named Henryk Skolimowski?
I have not. No.
I recommend him with some qualification in that all of his thought is not super strong, but some of it is really consonant with, I think, some of these emerging movements. And back in, I think it was, late 70s, early 80s, he wrote a book called The Participatory Mind.
Huh.
And he was looking at, the ontic epistemic loops that lead to, basically he sees evolution as the unfolding of sensitivities, of modes of detection, of the universe of itself. And that evolution kind of tracks deepening ways that the universe can become sensitive to itself, and participate with itself at deeper layers and deeper levels. So, and it's ecologically framed. And one of the things that he talks about, which I think is interesting also in terms of kind of the meaning crisis and where we are, he talks about different ages that we've been in, thinking about syntheism and several different threads. But one of them, he says that, the traditional in the West, the traditional frame he calls theos.
Okay.
And then we move into, with the Enlightenment, we move into what he calls mechanos.
Okay.
And beginning to see the world through the metaphor of the machine. And now he believes we're moving into what he would call the participatory age, but we're not there yet in terms of it consolidating. And so he draws this map of like these plateaus with that then drop into a big squiggly mess before they reach up and achieve another plateau. And so he feels that we're in that period right now where mechanos is breaking down.
Right.
And he believes, postmodern and integrative insights are going to allow us to eventually develop a much more ecologically sensitive and grounded philosophy that is centered on the notion of levels of sensitivity and participation with the cosmos.
Beautiful.
And so, I relate to that, as a beautiful vision that's very consonant with some of my own impulses, and I think what UTalk is about, and what several of our other projects are about is, I don't know, like Brian Swim, with his whole work with the New Universe story.
Yep.
One of the things that one of his phrases is, can science be something that is soul shaping and soul shaking?
Totally.
And I think we are at that point where if we really deeply contemplate what we are seeing about the world, and really begin to take to heart the lessons that science is giving us, there's good caution not to turn science into a religion. It'll mess it up, all of that.
Right.
But it can, I think, properly digested, feed new sensibilities, new ways of relating to life and universe and evolution, as fragile and precious and sacred, and something worth learning to dance with and participate with much more deeply.
Beautiful. That is, that's the, so many different wonderful threads there. We'll start with the basic structure of the UTalk project. It's, the argument fundamentally is that there's a big confusing vacuum that can be coherently filled in between the science of human psychology on the one hand and the humanistic psychotherapeutic enterprise of adaptive fulfillment on the other. I had the naive assumption that those things should go together, and then I had to learn that actually they really can't go together in the current structure of the modern scientific intellectual architecture. You either drop into some sort of incoherent physical reductionism, or you then expand into some incoherent big picture view. Those are your basic options, and the system does since the experts don't know how to translate that, how the hell could the society translate it, right? If the best minds can't freaking translate it, then Joe on the street can't translate it. But there is now a translation that's happening, and certainly John's climbing up, philosophy and cognitive science mountain on the one hand, and then the UTalk really does say, hey, there is a real clear and obvious thing called the science of psychology. And they tried to carve science and behavior and mind up in particular ways. And everybody agrees that it makes no sense. Scholarship agrees that really it's just really the method, and then you build it, and then and it's like, well, there can be made sense of. And when you do, you realize that things like soul and spirit are essential categories that can be defined in the context of a naturalistic scientific ontology. You know, they're not, only a physicalist reductionist would try to eliminate those types of things. And we absolutely, it's silly. You just go back to Aristotle's scales of freaking nature. I mean, there is think a Schumacher, there's mineral matter, that's the stand. Underneath that, there's energy now, we know that. And then, there's foundational, what I would call implicate order stuff underneath matter that allows a quantum mechanical understanding of energy information. Then you get the normal size material world, that we're in, that's dead in and of itself. Or, I mean, it's like, it's complicated at the level of just matter. And then this is the other point I wanted to make, there's another story here, but Bruce knows the story. He sends me this yin yang symbol after our conversation about I-Quad, which we never got to the punchline of, but trust me, it all comes back to one.
I want to still, yes.
It's a punchline. Anyway, yeah, poor Bruce had to go through 2.5 hours and we never got to a punchline, but he coped. He was a good sport. But anyway, so afterwards we're talking, and the backstory of I-Quad. I have this coin. I'm just listening to this for the listeners. There's this really, really layered relationship between mathematical operators as knowers and this structure of mathematical operations and how they apply to physics and the nature of the physical world and how you can collapse those to a particular set and see sort of a structure of coherence that actually contains our mathematical physical insights in a new way. And so Bruce then sends me this super cool yin yang picture that I hadn't seen, okay? And on one side is ontology, that's like in the black, and then the white circle there is like epistemic. And then the other side is epistemology, and then ontic, okay? And so the story here for folks that are, in terms of following, so I get trained as a psychological scientist, all right? And Roy Bhaskar is completely correct. Psychological science in particular commits the epistemological epistemic fallacy, okay? And what does that mean? Basically, psychological science is, well, how do you know? Do you know based on folk psychology and intuition, or do you know based on empirical epistemology forged in the modern scientific revolution? This is the good way to know, and this is the bad way to know, and good knowledge is scientific. That's why there's an entire thing called clinical science in psychology, and basically all of your knowledge should be grounded in empirical science. That's the whole justification, okay? So as if now, and Roy Bhaskar, if you know Roy Bhaskar at all, as if the way in which you know now assures that what you know is valid, regardless of what you say to be real, i.e. ontology. Like, what do you mean by mind and behavior? If you can't answer your ontological references, okay, then you can't claim coherent scientific knowledge, all right? So, and in fact, I went back to my earlier stuff. I have a 2003 paper where I opened the tree of knowledge in theoretical unification of psychology. And you could see this in history. I start with, well, there's a problem of epistemology, okay? And now I look back at, no, it is a problem of ontology, epistemology, and metaphysics, people. There's a problem, the whole philosophy is all screwed up. But no, as a scientist, I thought about really philosophy was basically epistemology. So then I split and learned to split ontology off from epistemology and see, obviously there's claims about what is real, and then there's how we know about them. Okay, that's split one. Split two then is I'm in the conversation with Alexander Bard, like late 2018, okay? And I'm using ontology, blah, 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 but my language is not clear because I'm not clear whether I'm talking about beliefs about what is real, okay, and how we know about what's real versus what's actually real. Mm-hmm. And Bard's like, Henricus, do you know the difference between the ontic reality and ontology? Okay. And I was like, yeah, kind of, but not really. All right. So ontology is fundamentally then, of course, you can make the case that it's how we know about the real, beliefs about the real, versus the ontic reality, which is reality itself, if you want to use that term. So then I was like, and in fact, I saw in the Tree of Knowledge, I was like, oh my God, of course, the matter, life, mind side, okay, is really representing the ontic reality. And physics, biology, psychology, and social sciences are really now the ontology developed by scientific epistemology to map the ontic reality.
Right.
Okay. So now we have a very clear, now I'm saying, oh my gosh, yes, it's reality and science and the mapping of the two that makes it really unique. And it says how physics maps matter, biology maps the life sciences, and now psychology should map this third dimension, which is animal mind, and then the human sciences should map this fourth dimension, culture person. Okay, fast forward now to this image that Bruce sends me, which has the epistemic, okay, relative to epistemology. So now we're dividing, right, well, so that's just the process by which you know. Now epistemology would be the science or the study of how you know. Okay. So then now this was in the last like 4 days, people are up to speed. Now we're getting really up to speed, people, in terms of history. So the other day I was walking after you sent this and I was like, well, where does epistemics like actually fit in the real world? Okay. It's the cognitive process of knowing in the world. All right. And then what I did was like, oh my gosh, maybe when I talk about the different dimensions of complexity, okay, I'm very keen on saying, well, there's different levels of complexity within a dimension. Okay, so you go from atoms to molecules, that's a jump within. But then when you go from molecules to cells, that's a jump between. Okay, and then life is between, and then mind, and then culture. And each one of these is really a complexity building feedback loop that gives rise to an information processing system within and a communication system between. Okay, and that's a complex plane of existence. And there's all these big questions. Well, what is that? And blah, blah. It's sort of biological information processing, biological semiotics, biological cognition, biological epistemics. Could it be, right? It's the way the cell knows stuff. And then if we jump up to mind, then it would be, well, mind really then is being guided by the neurocognitive epistemic process of the nervous system generating knowledge that coordinates its functional awareness and responses. And then you get all the way up into, well, the process by which we know through propositional justification, okay? So now the epistemic division then allowed me to put that in the context of the ontic reality so that I could actually see the knowledge systems that are generated at the level of life, mind, and culture as a way of describing the ontic epistemic feedback loop, you know? And to bring it back, I know it's a long detour, but to bring it back to your point about the world really is awakening itself up to increasingly deeper, broader, emanating sensitivities. Emanating capacities to know and to coherently integrate that knowledge and then participate in response to it. You can then see that feedback curvature all the way up the tree of knowledge to the point that brings us to this conversation.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. And, you know, what strikes me about that image, Joel Morrison is the creator of that image of the yin yang with those four elements. And yeah, because there's in postmodernism and modernism, you know, you see different kinds of splits where there's not an equal, you know, balanced or I think adequate holding of these different things. And, you know, so ontology is epistemic.
Yep.
You know, people sometimes speak of ontology as if they're talking about the thing itself, but ontology with the logos at the end
of that in the past.
Me too. Yeah, ontology with the logos at the end means it's epistemic, and you know, epistemology is, you know, or the epistemic is actually ontic in that the ick at the end of there indicates it's a real thing, and that the epistemic is not only how we know, but the very fact of our knowing, that there is this knowing process that's part of the architecture of being, right? And I think that you talk is what you're describing here is a very beautiful way of mapping how that what are the different layers and systems of the epistemic as they evolve greater levels of sensitivity and capacity for knowing and detection.
Boom, here's to you talking.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll turn it into a verb. We'll bounce around the grammatology of you talk. Love it.
Yeah.
No, actually, I can sit with that for a little while. That's some good dialogos right there. That's what that is. I love that. It's a beautiful thing.
Me too. Yeah. Really appreciate um, the synergy that I feel, emerging here in terms of different things that we're looking at and how they're docking up. It's
Yeah.
very beautiful. Are you familiar with Peter Sloterdijk's book, You Must Change Your Life, or much
I heard you mention it. Now, remember, Bruce, I am hopelessly ignorant about most things in the world.
Oh, not at all. No way.
That's our default. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what, well, actually, I should say that. I really think I've said that recently because somebody was saying, "Hey, you don't understand Hegel," on the Bard's list. Okay. And my reply to him was, I don't understand 99.9% of the people in the world. Right. I was listening to this whole story about Islamic scholars. Okay. I listened to 4 of them. I had never heard of a single one. These are the major figures in Islamic tradition. I couldn't pronounce any of their names. I didn't know anything of what they did. And this is a gigantic tradition of thousands of years, 1,000-year or whatever, of people that have richly studied him. I can name one person, right? I don't think I'm alone in this because, but that's the point, is that no matter how much we know, we're always just this little drop in the bucket. I don't know anything about Confucian scholarship, in that.
Right.
I don't know anything about the Hindu world at all. I mean, that's the oldest, that and Zoroastrianism. Bard start talking Zoroastrianism. So these are gigantic traditions of which I can't say a paragraph about, So that's what I mean in relation. And I say that with a fair amount of confidence. I'm relatively learned by normal standards, right? But it is also true that it's just all inspiring about what's out there, and we're inevitably ignorant as a function.
It's on the one part, it's the fault of our own education systems, but on the other hand, it's just the fault of being human, and we just don't have. We can't hold it all. There's just no way we can hold it all, right? And so I think, what we're attempting in these different meta communities is, none of us has to hold it all. But if, and what John is doing too with the Dialogos, and, if we can build at least the technologies of dialogue and communication that can allow for us to, enrich each other, none of us have to hold it all. But if we find new ways to synergize.
Totally. And they could do so much better. I look back at my education. There's no even attempt to offer an architecture that can hold virtually any of it. We don't even hold our own traditions, yet alone create a space where we can hold our own and hold another tradition. I mean, it's just unbelievably bad in relationship to providing the kind of necessary architectural knowledge container that would allow people to drink from the various sources that are available.
I hope we can, I think the wonderful work Zach is doing in education and what, many in our community, I think are working towards. I'm hoping there can be some kind of upgrades in the ways that we, educate ourselves. Sloterdijk has an approach that he calls, disciplinics, but he's looking at a new education system that would really expose us to many more domains of practice across traditions than we currently have. But the reason I brought him up now is, and what you were mentioning about maybe what the Islamic scholars or what Alexander Bard is doing with Zoroastrianism, I see it also in Sloterdijk, and that is looking back at our old, and it's in line with the sacred naturalism, actually, is what I'm wanting to say, is looking back at our old thought systems, whether they're, Catholic theological, which some people like Panikar or Sloterdijk are doing, or Graham Harman looking back to some old Islamic ideas, Bard looking back to Zoroastrianism. If we can, look back into these traditions and not just throw it out because it's metaphysical, but to appreciate kind of the epistemic systems that emerge there for certain ways of knowing and interfacing with reality that enfold in whole architectures of thought. Right. Not just, outmoded, primitive maps of reality, but there are actually architectures of thought there
Right.
that we can bring them forward in a way that can inform how we relate to the natural world, how we relate to therapeutic, exchanges. For instance, Sloterdijk is using old models of the Trinity to inform how we can understand the patient or the client and therapist relation. So there's so much there that I think we can still see and draw from and learn from in these ancient traditions that don't have to be held in a way that or don't have to be rejected because they're religious.
Right.
Because there's so much that they can teach us about how we can know and relate and be with each other, and the whole beautiful kaleidoscopic play of epistemics, you could say.
Totally. Yeah, I'm reminded of, actually, it was because of a conversation that you and Layman had on Integral Stage with Mark Edwards. I reached out to Mark Edwards, and who had gotten them enlightened by some of the Aboriginal traditions in Australia, and became, actually passionately convinced that the epistemics, if you want to use that term, or the way of being in nature and in relationship to each other, was fundamentally more advanced and sophisticated than we have any appreciation for. In fact, more advanced and sophisticated in many ways than we are, you would argue. And so rediscovering that kind of knowledge, and in terms of sacred naturalism, I think one of the things that we are most impoverished around is the fact that we don't know how to be with the living nature. We do not know. We don't know how to, we've built our cocoons of technology around us, and we have separated and jumped ourselves above, or really distorted and alienated from probably nature. And that would be a sensibility that would have inevitably just an enormous amount to teach us in relation.
I agree with that. And Tyson Yunkaporta is someone who's been appearing, and
yes,
I think really showing up as an important voice for that.
Amen.
And there was a recent book I came across too called Cannibal Metaphysics, and it's actually, I think it's Cannibal Metaphysics or Cannibal Ontology, but it's one of those. But it's actually it's also showing just how that there are deeply sophisticated ways that ontology and epistemology are held by even, tribal traditions that we would want to just write off from a, modern prejudice position, that actually have so much richness there and so much to teach us.
Totally. And that's, I interviewed her, and, I think you talked with her also, Lene Rachel Anderson's. I really like her short book on metamodernity. And I find that to be, if somebody were to ask me what is the meta-modern sensibility, I use her formulation, which basically looks at the emergence of cultural conscious codes or sensibilities through the oral indigenous, through the traditional formal, through the modern and the postmodern. Basically identifies the capacity for relationality and nurture in nature initially, and then the development of identity across heritage and religion, tradition, national identity that lives in a civilization. It's Bronze Age and Axial Age sensibilities and capacity for refined thought and writing. And then you get into the modern science, liberal democracy, capitalist enlightenment, hopefully gets reined in some. Then the postmodern critique of caring about the disenfranchised, caring about nature, and fundamentally recognizing that there's some overshoot in the arrogance of the modern empirical natural scientific view. All of that is sensibility that I think we can embrace in the 21st century. And I think the kind of ecologically informed sensibility that would be a participatory engagement across these different domains is what we need if we're going to, say, revitalize our soul and spirit and maintain a sustainable way of being in the world.
Exactly. Yeah, Layman mentioned to you that he and I are thinking about writing, actually not thinking about, we're starting work on writing a book on his metaphysics of adjacency and my grammatology. But I mentioned that now to say that, from a comment in a recent email from you, I also would love to collaborate with you and possibly Layman or others on either an anthology or just a text on the sacred naturalism, informed by UTalk and informed by some of these other approaches. I think that would be just really wonderful.
That'd be great. I would super welcome that. And really, as we begin maybe to bring this to a bit of a close, I would really like to hear when you look out at the horizon of the future and see what do you see happening? Where's your heart? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? What do you wish or hope or are trying to contribute to happening? What are you seeing in that regard as we sort of consolidate this really beautiful conversation and then sort of at least look out at the horizon and where we are and where we might go?
I sometimes look around and think that, for all my growing up, imagining myself being in the future, being in the futuristic 2020s, I never imagined it would look like this. There are some really wonderful things happening that I'm excited about. I think what's happening with the pandemic and some of the fracturing of our information ecology and some of the regressive movements, that are happening culturally, they're hard to take in and digest to some degree, so they do shake some of my early naivety. And I don't know if we're going to respond to the ecological challenges that we have in time to forestall or prevent some of the things that may happen. I definitely have, some, friends in this community who are doing what they call, post-doom thinking and prepping.
Yeah.
That, they're imagining that we're going to probably see some significant civilizational collapses. And then what do we do after that? I hope that's not in store for us. I think I'm happy I'm married to someone who grew up in rural Nepal and would know how to survive if necessary.
Right. I've already written an apology note to my kids that I was like, I became an academic professor and sorry if this goes bad. We will not be living off the land, or at least won't be the first to, that's for sure.
I have no idea what I would do. But, for me, what I do see hopeful and what I'm working for and aiming for is a lot of what we just talked about here, which is that, there is so much possible for us in, this kind of new meta space and the kind of cosmopolitanism that I think is showing itself there. And, my own sensibility of each of us as a wild knot of relations that reaches out, to so many different currents, ecological, social, and cultural in the world. I want to see us flower in a way that can foster that braiding, that can lead to the growing of multiple generative cultural enclosures that allows us to live in the world differently. And I think what I feel in this syncing up that I'm excited about is the threads coming together to form new cultural generative enclosures.
Yes.
Right. That I really feel I can be behind and excited about. And since I've been homeless before, and I have a wife who's, grew up in rural Nepal, I have the hope that I can survive if it all goes down.
Right.
But if it doesn't, I want to see us using technology to promote new forms of communication, new forms of contemplative practice, using VR to train our participatory sensibilities. There's so much that we can do,
Totally.
with the fifth joint point and what possibly could be coming. I think, it just feels to me that, we're prepping for something that is a new mode of being that I that I am excited about and hopeful for.
Beautiful. Wow, that's wonderful. Yes, that is. And as I find so often, there's such deep resonance with where I am in looking out on the horizon myself. I do feel that we're sort of on the edge of heaven and hell on earth. So it's, to me, what I said to my advisee when we talk about sort of the young man who's feeling so shriveled and beaten and just and confused. If we can figure out a way to get the message of how important this time is, and how, if we can rediscover the ways to fulfill and nourish the soul toward the spirit together and interweave the various potentials into something more coherent, then we can, I think, make a move to the adjacent possible and find ourselves in a new space. And the integral UTALK message really is everyone is holding on to partial truths. I mean, there is something, and if we can let go of our defensive position of the, kind of a modernist sensibility of, well, this is the justification of what's true, and if that's not true, no, actually there's a partial trans rationality that is available to us that actually can be integrated with a lot of precision and afford a huge amount of pluralism, and that we can live and nourish ourselves in that space. If we're able to find that culture and do it in time in relationship to what's happening with the planet and all the different changes, then man, maybe we can find our way to a realistic heaven. And at the very least, it tells me what I'm going to do in relationship to my little baton of energy information and my connections and networks and relations with others. How can I be positioned to maximize the likelihood that I'll be a good ancestor and do my best to move the system? And I so deeply feel that that's your orientation as well.
Yeah, I very much resonate with that. And, in my university, I'm able to talk to students about those things, and we wrestle with cultural and ecological and psychological and meaning crises in our kinds of classes. With someone like my son, who is a very sensitive person and just beginning to launch into the world, I don't want to talk to him about some of the daunting things that are there. I do some, but I don't want to drop a big bomb on him. He's trying to just craft a life and a career. But I do, in relating to him, one of the things I try to do is just ask questions and spark curiosity and allow for the making of connections in different domains that he can go with as he wants to go. So I try to approach it more obliquely and from underneath with questions and promptings rather than too much of a heavy world picture to, say, okay, now you've got to save us all.
Right. Well, I was a little less sensitive because as it dawned on me in 2017, 2018, I'd wander around my house going, global civilization collapse. We're all going to die. And my family would be like, oh my God, but sorry, family, but oh well. But I would put a smile on it and say, but maybe it's heaven too. So, there it is. But no, that's funny. Sensitive. And that's what that really is. How do we get the message of enough urgency, the proper level of crisis? I thought Jonathan Rowson made a comment about, tasting the pickle. He has a nice frame for it. And what I emphasize also is, listen, there's global civilization collapse, and that can mean endless number of things at a hyper object abstract level. It's a beautiful day, walk the dog, connect with people you love, and that, as long as that opportunity of the consciousness here and now can be afforded, let's take full advantage of it.
Beautiful. Amen to that.
All righty. Well, Bruce, thank you so much. Is there any place where you would like folks to find you, look you up on the web, or I could leave a link in the show notes, or?
I could give you that. Yeah, I have a link to, but I think the main thing probably where Layman and I both are hanging out the most now is on Integral Stage.
Okay.
I'm more often behind the scenes nowadays. I used to do more things, but now I'm busy with a lot of the production and all of that.
Right.
But yeah, definitely that's a place. And we we have a website kind of under construction for our work on religion and spirituality, integral religion and spirituality. That's not ready to share yet, but it will be eventually, and I'll let you know about that one.
Great. Well, I look forward to that coming out, and we'll share it as appropriate. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with me today. And I've deeply appreciated it. And I feel very soul spiritual fulfillment. Bruce, thank you so much.
Me too. Thanks so much. Yeah. Have a wonderful day.
Absolutely.